Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Bible in 90 Days weekly overview. We're now into the prophets. I hope you enjoyed your reading of the prophet Isaiah. And now we've begun to venture into Jeremiah. This coming week, we will finish Jeremiah, read Lamentations as well, and then get into the prophet Ezekiel. So today, I'd like to cover just Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the other two major prophets, along with the prophet Isaiah. Jeremiah expresses very harsh views about the temple in Jerusalem and God's judgment. And his views at the time were rejected by the establishment that did not want to heed his warnings. Jeremiah is active in the years leading up to the Babylonian exile, and as danger from neighboring countries increased, the leaders in Jerusalem doubled down on their conviction that because God dwelled in the temple, then nothing could ultimately befall the city, because God's presence was there in the midst of the city. Jeremiah challenges these views, taking the leaders to task for their sins and declaring that God would ultimately exercise judgment on them, even at the expense of Jerusalem. Jeremiah teaches us that prophecy is more complicated than just proclaiming God's word. It also requires embodying God's word. In many ways, this is similar to what church ministry might be. We could say the right things, but unless we also do them, our message will not be compelling. Jeremiah also evokes a great deal of sympathy because he bears an enormous burden for embodying the message that God gives to him. Jeremiah, in many ways, is the suffering prophet, for he pays some enormous prices for his unpopular message of accountability and warning that he gives to the leaders in Jerusalem. The book of Jeremiah has a long and complex history and development. We can't necessarily reconstruct that. Both prose and poetry are present throughout the book. The poetry is likely the oldest material that we have, and it seems like the prose material was added later to provide some context, and also to align what Jeremiah is saying with the values that we find in Deuteronomy. If you look back at the book of Deuteronomy, you'll see many of the same values, even some of the same phrases, also present in the book of Jeremiah. So clearly Jeremiah is rooted in the Deuteronomistic tradition. The historical circumstances of Jeremiah and Ezekiel are similar. They are exilic prophets, active in Jeremiah's case, leading right up to the Babylonian exile, and in Ezekiel's case, in the early days of the exile. So this is the time period that we are in, a very turbulent time where Babylon comes and destroys the city of Jerusalem. Jeremiah, as a prophet, as I have already suggested, an embodied prophet, performs what are called symbolic acts. Prophets often do this. They perform certain acts that get people's attention, and in so doing, they embody the prophecy that they proclaim. Jeremiah's symbolic act occurs in chapter 16 when God tells him not to take a wife. This was something that was almost completely unknown in Jeremiah's day, for an adult not to marry. To be childless in his day would be more or less to be almost worthless in that society. But this symbolic act serves the purpose of showing the desperate circumstances of Judah that would be coming near in the future. So by means of this symbolic act, we see that Jeremiah's entire life is bound up with his prophecy. Now, the temple, too, was a sort of embodied place, and Jeremiah's sermons against the temple and its practices challenge the notions that prevailed at the time about their embodied faith. The temple contained tangible ways in which the people experienced God's nearness. For example, the Ark of the Covenant was there in the temple. The tabernacle and the tent of meeting was also thought to be there. So the temple itself, in fact, was the most permanent place of God's presence, a tangible sign of God's presence with the people. When you entered the temple in Jerusalem, You could experience God's presence in such a way that the temple sort of served as a portal to the heavenly realm, if you will. The temple was the place where God's presence was mediated. And because the temple was in the city of Jerusalem, the city was thought to be invincible and incapable of being conquered. This was the Zion theological tradition that held strongly the Davidic covenant that proclaimed that a Davidic king would always be on the throne. And so as long as there was a Davidic king in Jerusalem, the presumption was that the city could not be conquered. We see the same conviction in certain psalms as well, some of those Zion psalms, like Psalm 125, for example. Even parts of the prophet Isaiah might have encouraged this notion. Chapters 36 through 39 in Isaiah describe Sennacherib's inability to conquer Jerusalem, and when Assyria failed to destroy the city, when they were the great power in the region, this view intensified all the more that Jerusalem was safe from outside enemies by virtue of the fact that God dwelled within its walls in God's temple. But the prophet Isaiah challenges this notion because the people had grown complicit in their conduct, failing to carry out God's word by virtue of the fact that there was a so-called invincibility in Jerusalem. This perception of invincibility did not lead to greater faithfulness on the part of the people. In fact, it jeopardized it. And Jeremiah's message is all about calling out this theology that suggested Jerusalem could not be overtaken. Jeremiah's temple sermon occurs twice in Jeremiah. It's probably the most important passage in the book. You can find it both in chapter 7 and in chapter 26. And in each case, Jeremiah's message has two parts. The first is simply, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. The prophet speaking for God. A demand that the people amend their doings. There was great injustice in Jerusalem at the time, but the people did not seem to address it with the urgency that the Torah would have merited. Jeremiah is the first to suggest that God's presence is conditional in that sense, and that God reserved the right to withdraw God's presence if indeed the people failed to live faithfully. The people were to live and embody a way of life that reflects God's desires for the community. Again, this is exactly the theology that we read about in Deuteronomy, with great concern for the outcasts and the foreigners and the widows and the orphans, those vulnerable people who those in power should be sure never to take advantage of. So the first part of Jeremiah's sermon is amend your ways and your doings. The second major point is the line, do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. Apparently, the deceptive nature of the words, this is the temple of the Lord, would be the subsequent assumption that therefore it could not be conquered. Jeremiah, again, warns not to trust in this blank check that was presumed on behalf of that God's presence would always be there on behalf of the people, no matter what they did. Jeremiah's argument is buffered by a pertinent example. Look what happened to Shiloh. Shiloh was the place where God was worshipped prior to Jerusalem, and it was destroyed. And the reason being was that they went after other gods. And so in the same way, Jeremiah warns that just as God withdrew God's name from Shiloh, so also God could do the same with Jerusalem. Even this phrase about making my name dwell with you is a very Deuteronomic phrase that we see throughout Jeremiah's temple sermons. In chapter 26, we get some biography along with the second telling of Jeremiah's sermon. We see that the officials in Judah declares that Jeremiah should be put to death for prophesying against the city. It's as if they assume that Jeremiah wants his words to come true, when in fact Jeremiah is simply the messenger. This is, in the Old Testament, the prophetic burden. This is a strong motif in many prophetic books. The prophets bear the burden of their message, for they pay the consequence of people's backlash against their message. even though their message simply comes from God. Defenders of Jeremiah point out that his message has its limits and that ultimately God is the source of them and that God is ultimately in control of carrying out the message or not. The prophetic word is always in God's control, and even after it is spoken, God can chart a new course if indeed the people respond to the prophetic word. But certainly there is strong backlash against Jeremiah throughout the book, and he suffers many physical consequences for his message. As far as the prophets go, Jeremiah is someone who is very distressed about his role as prophet. Again, his prophetic burden is especially heavy. It really weighs on him.
Sorry, I couldn't.
Jesus, it has been said by one of my professors, says Jesus had a poster of Jeremiah on his wall growing up, because in many ways the suffering of Jeremiah reflects the suffering of Christ later on when Christ is rejected for his words. Much of the same fate befalls the prophet Jeremiah. Isaiah may have been Jesus' theological guide, but surely Jeremiah was Jesus' sort of biographical guide, because their lives and certainly their suffering overlap in many ways. In fact, Jeremiah is sort of known for his complaining and his yelling at God. He speaks many laments that sound a lot like lament psalms as he wrestles with this burden that God has placed on him. In chapter 20 in particular, Jeremiah accuses God of forcing this prophetic call on him, and the language there is some of the most graphic in all of the scriptures. So certainly Jeremiah struggles a great deal with his prophetic call. But at the same time, the remarkable thing about Jeremiah is that he continues to intercede even on behalf of those who give him so much trouble. And this is a remarkable thing for a prophet to be able to do. Even those who oppose the prophet's message, the prophet still sees himself as an intercessor on their behalf before God, and so that speaks a lot to Jeremiah's integrity. So let's look at the structure of the book of Jeremiah as a whole. It seems to be mostly made up of about three sources. One is the poetic material that dominates chapters 1 through 25 of Jeremiah. There's also a lot of narrative biographical information in chapters 26 through 29 and 34 through 44. This biographical information may have been written by Jeremiah's scribe, whose name was Baruch. And then there are these prose sermons that are written in the style of Deuteronomy that appear to be a third source as well in the final form of this book. Much of the book is inspired, as I mentioned before, by the genre of individual lament. In fact, the same pattern that we observed that individual laments follow in the Psalms can also be observed in many of Jeremiah's laments. They begin with a complaint. They have a petition asking God to do a certain thing. God save me. Don't let those who oppose me have the last word. Then there is a confession of trust, the assurance that God has heard the words and the prayer of the prophet, and then ultimately words of praise for all that God has done and will surely continue to do. And Jeremiah's confessions and lamentations are scattered throughout the book. We see them in chapter 11 into chapter 12 in a lament that describes a situation where the very people in Jeremiah's own hometown are seeking to do him in. Makes you think of Jesus' words, "A prophet is not welcome in his hometown." Well, indeed, that is the case for the prophet Jeremiah, and much of his suffering comes from the fact that it's brought on by those in his inner circle. All betrayals are difficult, but those that come from the closest to a person are surely the very most challenging to deal with. Jeremiah 15, verses 10 through 21 is another great lament. "Woe is me, that my mother bore me at all. It would have been better had I never even been born," Jeremiah says there. Chapter 17, we see one that has a petition to kill the enemy. "Save me and heal me, save me." Jeremiah 18 as well notes that plots are being made against Jeremiah to put him to death because of his troubling message. And Jeremiah is simply fed up with people not listening, and so he prays for their destruction because they are after him, hoping to bring him down. And if somebody's going to live and somebody's going to die, of course, Jeremiah wants the death to be of his enemies. And then I mentioned before, chapter 20, some of the most intense language in the Bible, that Jeremiah was forced into this prophetic role. But the assurance of trust there is that surely God is with me like a warrior, and surely God will ultimately prevail. We might wonder what Jeremiah's complaints ultimately say about the nature of God. Jeremiah, in the end, finally expresses his belief that God is ultimately fair, despite his honest and raw complaints. Jeremiah's complaints don't define who God actually is, but it certainly expresses complaint over what God has called him to do, which is a challenging thing. But it does end with confidence that God does not ultimately allow the righteous to suffer and the wicked to prevail. Again, these same concerns that we saw so much in the Psalms of Lament not long ago when we read through the Psalter. So perhaps the overall purpose of these many laments in Jeremiah is to portray the prophet's rejection on the one hand, but also to declare his faithfulness to God's call on the other. And it is these two sorts of polar opposites that we see held together in the prophet Jeremiah that makes the book so compelling. So enjoy your reading of Jeremiah, and notice all the ways in which his sufferings mirror the sufferings of Christ as you make your way through that book. And now let's have a look at the prophet Ezekiel as well, the third major prophet. Ezekiel is a priest. He comes from the priestly tradition. So while Jeremiah is rooted in the Deuteronomic tradition, Ezekiel is rooted in the priestly tradition. And like Jeremiah, also, Ezekiel performs symbolic acts. Ezekiel's are even more bizarre. For one, he's told to build a replica of Jerusalem and to depict upon it the siege of Jerusalem that is coming. He's also told to mix various grains and break bread over human dung. It's a very sort of gross passage. If you've ever noticed Ezekiel bread in the frozen food section of the grocery store, that bread is derived from the fact that the prophet Ezekiel is told to bake bread with certain grains. But I'm a big fan of Ezekiel bread, so I trust that it was not baked over human dung as the prophet was told to do in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel's a strange guy. You'll certainly realize that right away. And his book is one of the strangest in the Bible. It has some hints of early apocalyptic literature, kind of stuff we'll see much more of in the book of Daniel and then later in the book of Revelation as well. Many prophets see visions, some of them bizarre, but Ezekiel's visions certainly push the envelope to new lengths, push prophetic visions to their new limits in terms of their intensity and the bizarre nature of them. Ezekiel is active in the early years leading up to the exile. He was one of the first people apparently exiled from Jerusalem in 597 when Babylonian came and deposed the king and put a puppet king on the throne. Remember, Jerusalem was destroyed in 587, but for the previous decade, it was already under Babylonian control. They just hadn't destroyed it yet. But when they first took over the city in 597 BC, they did send off a handful of people into exile, and it appears that Ezekiel was one of those people. So the book is set among the exiles at the river Chebar, and among those who were exiled with King Jehoiachin. I'm sorry, I always mix up Jehoiachin and Jehoiakim, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. This event, by the way, is detailed in 2 Kings 25, if you want to go back and have a look at that. So Judah became a vassal of Babylon in 597. The Babylonians replaced Jehoiachin with their own king, Jehoiakim, but Jehoiakim refused to pay tribute to the king of Babylon, and so that's why they returned and destroyed the city in 587. So it's helpful to have a refresher about all of those historical details as you enter into the book of Ezekiel. And so then Ezekiel was taken into exile with Jehoiachin in 597. Ezekiel was a Zedekite priest in charge of what went on in the temple. So he was an integral part of both the religious and the political life of Judah. This is a very sort of professional person. Other prophets might be sort of people from the edges of society, but Ezekiel was a part of the professional establishment, both the religious and the political establishment in Jerusalem. And much of the book of Isaiah takes place in that interim period between 597 and 587, when Jerusalem was ultimately destroyed. Let's have a look at the book in terms of its structure. This book was likely assembled by Ezekiel's disciples. At this time, most of our prophets are the leaders of a group of prophets. So prophets came to have disciples, and many of them also had scribes that took down their words and so on. Ezekiel 1 through 24 are predictions of judgment anticipating the destruction of Jerusalem that was to come in the year 587. So that's the big first chunk of the book of Ezekiel, is predicting the pending destruction of Jerusalem. Chapters 1 through 3 are a lengthy description of the initial call to be a prophet that we find in Ezekiel. By the way, you'll see in so many of these prophet books, these call narratives. We saw it in Isaiah 6, right, with his vision of the throne room. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, that famous line. We also see it at the beginning of Jeremiah, when the God says, before you were formed in the womb, I knew you. Ezekiel's call vision takes place in the first 3 chapters of his book, and then chapters 8 through 11 detail his vision of the temple. Chapters 25 through 32 contain oracles against foreign nations, as Ezekiel proclaims judgment upon the neighbors of Judah who assisted in Judah's downfall, those opportunist neighbors who hopped on the Babylonian bandwagon as Babylon was gaining power. Chapters 27 and 28 are particularly interesting. They're oracles for the destruction of Tyre, and there are oracles in there that are specifically directed against the prince and the king of Tyre. The king of Tyre, Ezekiel says, is described as one like a god who will fall like a mortal. And it's from some of these oracles against the king of Tyre that the legend of Lucifer falling from heaven and becoming the devil is derived from. So when you read those parts, those were originally prophecies against the king of Tyre, and certainly they take on a myth, sort of a mythological interpretation later on as the notion of a devil develops in the Christian tradition. Chapters 33 through 48 of Ezekiel are promises of restoration. Certainly, promises of restoration were needed among the exiles in the midst of the desolation that came from their life being so altered at the time of the exile. Chapters 33 through 37 are proclamations of salvation, ending in the great story of the Valley of Dry Bones, where God comes to Ezekiel and says, "Can these bones live?" And Ezekiel says, "You, Lord, are the one who knows." And then God promises that new flesh and bone and sinew will take shape, and God's breath will come back into the people. This beautiful and compelling, almost resurrection-like image in the prophet Ezekiel chapter 37, as he declares that there are good days ahead again for the house of Israel. Chapters 40 through 48 are sort of a long and tedious end to the book of Ezekiel. This is a vision of a new temple, vision of a restored temple, which, like many of the texts describing the tabernacle, is very detailed and very number-oriented. This is not something that you could actually use to build a new building. It wouldn't add up. But instead, the vision sort of seems to be a kind of icon to give people hope in the future, something on which to set their sights. I'd like to take a little bit of time to look more closely at Ezekiel's vision that occurs in the midst of his call narrative in chapters 1 through 3, because I think it's important for unpacking the sort of prominence that was assigned to this particular prophet. At the beginning of the book, a formula is given for the year, month, and day of the prophet's words and call. This is something, again, very typical of priestly writing. They were very careful record keepers. And it says, in the 30th year. The question is, the 30th year of what? It's also the 5th year of the exile of Jehoiachin. So we're looking at 594, 593, something like that, when this book begins. But we don't know what it's the 30th year of. It might have been the 30th year since Josiah's reforms were enacted in Jerusalem. That was a major point in the history of Israel there. Perhaps it's referring to the 30th year of Ezekiel's own life. In the 30th year of a male in Judah, that would be the year that he took a more public role. Remember, Jesus begins his ministry at age 30. That's a very standard year when you would begin a sort of public career. So we're not quite sure what that 30th year thing refers to. But the note that the prophet is by the river Chebar immediately is a sign that God's presence is there with the people, even in an unclean land. Ezekiel's visions of the wheel as well. I always think of that children's song about Ezekiel saw the wheel. You know, this image of the wheel that's so prominent in Ezekiel, it shows that God is mobile, that God has wheels, that God is not stuck in the temple in Jerusalem, but that God accompanies the people into exile. And that becomes a hugely encouraging and important image, as you can imagine, for people who have been sent away from their homeland to know that their God is still with them. The rest of Ezekiel's vision here in these opening chapters is very interconnected with his own Hebrew tradition and even the traditions of the surrounding cultures. Ezekiel seems to be familiar with the call narratives of Isaiah and Jeremiah, because so much of the language surrounding his vision is similar to what's found there. He seems to be familiar with the language of God's appearance on Mount Sinai, all the way back in the Torah. He even seems to know something about Genesis 1, especially the idea of the Spirit of God hovering over the watery chaos and calling forth order and life. Also, he seems to know some popular myths from the ancient Near East, including the notion of Baal, the Canaanite god who was thought to ride on storm clouds. You'll see that this vision draws on that image too. So it's a vision that has tons of interrelatedness with other biblical texts and other texts from the ancient Near East. And there's a lot going on in this vision. There's a firestorm. There's this image of gleaming amber, which I'll return to in a minute. There's 4 living creatures. Again, those are parallels with Isaiah 6 and the cherubim and seraphim flying around the throne. There's a cherubim throne, a cherubim throne. So many similarities there to what we've seen in other prophets. And then we have this event where Ezekiel eats a scroll, and it's sweet as honey. This image of God, of the prophet taking the words of God into himself so that he can now speak them in his prophetic role. Ezekiel sees God's dwelling place as a sort of archetype of the whole cosmos, of the whole creation. He sees God's dwelling place with the people as something that he is able to be privy to even in exile in the land of Babylon, something that, again, would have been very profound for folks in his day. What does the vision mean? That's a big question, and a lot of ink has been spilled trying to answer it. Certainly the vision prefigures God's glory, abandoning the temple and coming with the people into exile. Ezekiel sees God's glory from the place where one would not expect to see it, namely in a foreign land. That Ezekiel sees the vision in Babylon assures the exiles that God has not abandoned them, and this whole notion of God's presence or God's absence is very important in the book of Ezekiel. When God leaves the temple in Jerusalem, the temple is left defenseless. But when God shows up in Babylon, Ezekiel is empowered to prophesy and to be a watchman for the people of Judah, to whom he will proclaim God's word. So the vision proclaims, first and foremost, that God is present, not only with the prophet Ezekiel, but also by extension with the people to whom he prophesies. The vision also makes a grand claim about Ezekiel. And this is something I really want to spend a little time talking about. This image of gleaming amber is sort of a mysterious Hebrew term, the hashmal. It's seen in the midst of fire in the vision, and it may be a reference to God's face. Now, it's a big deal if the prophet Ezekiel is claiming to have seen God's face, right? Because this would mean that Ezekiel is claiming to have seen something that no ordinary person could claim, right? There was a tradition that no one could look upon the face of God and live. Even Moses only got a glimpse of God's backside. If you remember, Moses said, "Show me your glory," and God says, stand at the cleft of the rock and I will pass by. What Moses sees there is God's backside, not God's face. So if indeed the gleaming amber that Ezekiel sees in his vision is God's face, Ezekiel is doing something that no other mortal has ever been able to do and live. It's a remarkable claim about this prophet. And it begs the question then, if Ezekiel is the most superior prophet in Israel's history. In fact, in chapter 43, Ezekiel gives Torah. He gives the law, which puts him on par with Moses as the only other figure in the Old Testament who gives Torah, or who is said to give Torah. And if you look at Deuteronomy 34:10, it says that no prophet has arisen quite like Moses, which may be a sort of counter-narrative. Perhaps it was written because Ezekiel was claiming to be greater, or was thought to be greater by the people, and so Deuteronomy 34:10 is a sort of corrective to that. Who knows? It's difficult to piece together. But suffice it to say that Ezekiel was ultimately an enormous presence in the history of prophecy in Israel. It's easy to sort of overlook Ezekiel after you get through Isaiah and Jeremiah, who are major figures themselves, but also Ezekiel was a much highly regarded prophet too, and demands our full attention. He also demonstrates as a prophet that the line between priest and prophet, remember Ezekiel was a priest and a prophet, he demonstrates that the line between the two is not always drawn very sharply. Certainly he was an important figure in Israel's history, and he shouldn't be overshadowed by other prophets. Although his book can feel a little bit long, as some sections, particularly the end, can be a little bit tedious to read. So that's a bit of an introduction for you to these next two major prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, two wonderful books. I hope you will thoroughly enjoy your reading of them this week. I hope to see you in one of our Zoom meetings. Come with questions, comments. Don't forget to participate online on Facebook if you have other questions you want to share. And good luck. God bless you in your reading. We'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.